Okay, welcome back. I'm Dr. Feist. I'm still talking about the Nicomachean Ethics, still in Book 10, Chapter 5, finishing up Aristotle's last second discussion of hedone, of pleasure. We've seen in the previous video, go back and check that out if you didn't watch it, Aristotle talking about different kinds of pleasures, linking them up with senses, etc., etc., basically crawling into the notion, the concept of hedone, and trying to articulate it a little bit because it plays such a serious role, he says, for everybody in the general public, philosophers alike, that hedone is a big part, a key part of the notion that we're all after, eudaimonia. So different senses, right, taste, touch, smell, all that. Different senses exist, yes. So there are different perfections, right? We talked about perfections and pleasures associated with senses. And remember, the whole idea of perfections was it's complete, it's independent. You can't make it better, you can't make it, put it this way, you can't make it better, you can only make it worse. That's the notion of something that is a perfection, right? Remember the trite example about a pizza. If you add any more, you take you're diminishing the perfection of it, or if you take anything away, etc., etc. So with perfections, they're complete and they're independent and they're kind of like in the moment. Each sense has an associated perfection, right? So if your eyes and everything are working properly, there's a certain perfection there, can't take anything away, can't add to it. So as you look at something and if your eyes are working properly, that's the perfection of vision. And of course, all the other senses. And that's a pleasure, right? As we do normally say, oh, that's very pleasurable we really don't notice this in everyday life, but if you're ever sick or something and your body isn't working right, and then bang, when you come back online and you feel healthy again, there is such pleasure in just like, oh, finally, my stomach feels right, or something like that. Or, if you have, I don't know, something like pink eye or whatever, and your eyes are incredibly itchy and you can't see that well, when all of a sudden that's cleared up, it's just an absolute pleasure that your vision is working properly. So each sense has an associated pleasure. Well, Aristotle, trying to be what I've mentioned a little bit, but again, kind of be a naturalist. Remember, he brought the good down from the Platonic heights way back in the earlier books when he was examining Plato's notion of the good and said, that's too abstract. So Aristotle is picking up on our experiences of our senses, the pleasures that are associated with them, and then says, well, that seems like a way to go. Let's look at that and extend it to the mind. In other words, the intellect, that too has an associated pleasure. You might not think of it quite as a pleasure, but think about when you're playing chess or you're reading a novel or any of these kinds of things that are essentially mental activities, there's often great pleasures associated with them. And if chess or reading novels isn't your thing, another kind of mental pleasure is, it could be in everyday life when you're trying to think about something and solve a problem, like, how to fix a car or whatever, or what's a proper thing to do in a certain situation, when's the bus coming or whatever. When you have a problem that you're mentally working on and then you figure it out, that's actually quite pleasurable. It's like, okay, I get it now. So this idea of having a moment that's contained, that's enjoyable, that's purely mental, that's a pleasure of the mind. And so the intellect, then Aristotle says, it's like a sense in that it has an associated pleasure as well. Now Aristotle goes on to offer a few reflections on and bringing it around to morality again, because ultimately, remember, the whole discussion about hedone is an attempt to lead up and answer the question, what's eudaimonia? So in this sense here, Aristotle offers a few reflections. He says, look, and we've seen this argument earlier in Eudoxus and in the Philebus of Plato, that if an activity, Z, whatever it is, plus pleasure, is going to be greater than or better than activity Z, especially, and he adds this little bit on, if an activity Z is morally good, and then the result is that the accompanying pleasure will be morally good, and that will be better than just the activity alone. Of course, if the activity is morally bad, then that accompanying pleasure will be bad as well. And so again, Aristotle is really just talking about if you say something like helping people out, bringing food to those that are hungry, giving water to thirsty dogs, that is very pleasurable to me. People would say, well, that's okay. That's a good thing to feel pleased about that. But if you said, upsetting people, teasing people, I derive great pleasure in that, you will then be morally condemned for that. No, that's a bad thing. You shouldn't find pleasures in that. And again, as Aristotle points out, we have to educate our pleasures. And recall the earlier discussions of moral virtues when they're learned by habituation, by habit. He's very big on, okay, you got to educate the pleasures to make sure that your pleasures are, that pleasure as sort of a part of you is disassociated from morally bad actions and associated with morally good actions. And why is it that it's good to associate pleasure with morally good actions? Well, because pleasures anchor us. Pleasures influence us. Aristotle says an activity is augmented, right? If it's a good activity, it's augmented when pleasure is connected to it. And he gives an example in the mental realm. Think about if you're studying geometry, Aristotle says, and if you really like it, like if you're like, oh, I like this stuff. This is cool. This is interesting, and you like it, and you derive pleasure out of doing your geometry exercises or studying geometry. Well, unless you have some really problem with it, conceptually or whatever. But all things considered, two people that are, shall we say, equal in terms of their mental abilities to grasp mathematics, the person who loves it is going to do better, because they're going to be more attentive to it, they're going to be more into it. So pleasures will direct us. So pleasures are important on the road to achieving certain things that we want. So those that do a task Z will do it better, more thoroughly, if pleasure accompanies Z. Pleasure is the great attractor. It's also the great distractor. Aristotle says, students are not going to concentrate on their philosophy if they're really into music. So he was aware of distraction, right? That's nothing new. The distraction of a pleasure, like, if you're really into music and someone starts playing some music and you're trying to read, and if that's what you're more interested in, you derive more pleasure from the music, you're going to move away from your philosophical studies and start listening to the music. And so this notion of living in the age of distraction, as we like to say, with all of our devices or whatnot, that's we probably have more distractions than ever, but the very idea of being distracted by our pleasures in a bad sense, and a good sense as well. Aristotle was aware of that. That in itself is nothing new. So pleasure can be a great attractor and a distractor. So we have to get a handle on our pleasures, and Aristotle has been stressing that throughout. Now, the senses, here's where we get into something kind of interesting and a little bit odd, but here's sort of a ranking. And in the history of Western thought, there is kind of an intrinsic notion, or at least intrinsic, not in the sense that I would say it's correct, but because it's debatable. But there has been the thinking in Western thought to a great degree, which Christianity picked up and magnified. But you find it in Aristotle. You find it strongly written out in various dialogues of Plato, and in some later thought, like in Plotinus. The notion of matter or material being of a lower level or an inferior grade of existence to things that are more abstract, like mathematics. That's a common idea. And it has been used in various philosophies, as I've mentioned. Aristotle, we find it here too. So in this sense, with this idea in mind, Aristotle ranks the senses. He says, look, there are levels of purity in our senses. And by purity, you can think of it this way. It's this little idea here. That the more pure, the less matter is involved. So the notion of matter was somehow regarded as problematic. And this is essentially when you look at Plato's doctrine of the cave. Sorry, I shouldn't call it a doctrine. It's an allegory of the cave. And the allegory, it has two sides, as an allegory does. Roughly, it goes like this, that there is the story, and then there is the meaning of the story. And the story of the allegory of the cave is very simple. There's a group of people in a cave, and they're all watching shadows on the wall, and then suddenly, for reasons that in the dialogue, the Republic is where you find this, for reasons that are not clear, Socrates, who's telling this story here, says that someone just manages to look away from the wall, and then eventually they manage to leave the cave going, hey, this cave is just kind of like, as we would say today, like a movie theater, and then go outside and see real reality and see real light from the sun rather than sort of this movie light that's in the cave, etc., etc. That's basically the story. But as it is, it's an allegory. So what's the allegorical side of this in the sense of what's the meaning of this? Well, the idea, and philosophy, and Socrates says that philosophy is a kind of learning to die. Now, by no means he's advocating suicide. That's not the way to read it. What he's talking about here with philosophy learning to die and how that links up with the allegory of the cave is something like this. It is in the cave that the mind is trapped, like the mind in its body. And the cave is an allegorical sort of correlate, and it says that the cave is like a body, right? And what you're trying to do in philosophy is to get outside the body, to get away from the corporeal, the material world. And so you can see why, and even today we often, kind of praise people that are like, oh, I'm above materialism. I think life is, there are things in life that are more important than material objects. So that idea of a higher way of seeing things when you look beyond the material, that's with us today, and it was back in Aristotle's time too. I mean, we can debate that. I'm just pointing it out that a lot of people still think that. So the idea that you get out of the cave, you get out of the body, and you look at higher things. So in that sense, the levels of purity, right, have less matter involved. The more you get away from matter, the better. And of course, the ultimate act of getting away from matter, Aristotle thought, was thinking, right? Because it's a different kind of operation of the soul. One operation of the soul, is basic things like seeing and hearing. Those are operations, those are functions of the soul. But thinking is another function of the soul, and thinking is even more removed from material objects. But back down to something a little bit more straightforward. Sight, for instance, is purer than taste. Why? Because in Aristotle's view, of course, he didn't have our theories of sight and light waves, etc., etc. But just for trying to understand Aristotle, he didn't think that there was really matter involved. He thought forms were involved, but not matter. So when you looked at things in Aristotle's understanding of sight, there wasn't, like matter involved in it. It was something a little bit different. So, in any case, to unpack all that, we'd have to go into a lot more of Aristotle's biology, but that's not necessary for us here. Just think of it that sight really doesn't have a very little matter involved. It's just basically the organ in a certain kind of non-physical type interaction with the object. Taste is different. Right? Because you really do need matter here. Not only do you have the physical organ, the tongue, but there has to be some contact as well. So in order to taste something, like you want to taste a little bit of wine or some cheese or whatever, there has to be contact. So matter is extremely important, and contact. So you could say, well, sight is going to be purer than taste. Hearing, right? That is going to be a purer sense than touch, because again, touch, you need contact, right? And you need matter. So that's why, with this idea of this sort of general little rule here of the more pure, the less matter involved, you can see why the Greeks, by believing in that and holding that kind of as an axiom, that the Greeks would exemplify and delight in sight. That sight is the highest of all the sensory functions that we have, and Plato stresses vision, right? Sort of a kind of, and when we talk about a true understanding, we'll often say, yeah, I see what you mean. Although we sometimes say, I hear what we mean, but we never say something like, I touch or I taste what you mean. No, we don't use that. But we might use hearing a little bit. In other traditions, hearing is actually, in the Jewish tradition, you find notions of hearing as a very elevated form, because you hear the words of the divinity and the divine rather than seeing. But that's another story. But in the Greek view, it's more along the lines of the purity is the removal of matter, and sight is up there at the top. And so Aristotle says, well, let's just push it one step further and look at the hedone here in the terms of the pleasures of the intellect. And the pleasures of the intellect, because, the intellect is conceiving of things like, forms, mathematical objects, moral principles, all that kind of stuff. It's exceeding in purity all the pleasures of the senses. So that's way at the top. So you have the senses, you can rank them in terms of their purity, but once you bring in the notion of the mind and thought and all that, now you're in sort of another more rarefied but pure atmosphere. So this notion of contemplation and the life of the mind, that's going to be a higher life. And Aristotle would, if he were alive today, he would ask us and say, well, what do you admire more? Someone who is really into things and all things bodily sensations, that's all I'm in it for, is just to acquire as many bodily pleasures as I can, right, by objects and food and sex and all that stuff. Or if someone says, well, that stuff's fine, but that's not my main thing. I'm more interested in, going to art galleries and looking at great art and listening to Mozart and things like that. Who do we tend to admire? Aristotle would say, well, have a look at that. You're not all that different probably from what I'm saying. Anyways, you can quibble about that, but that's Aristotle's point, and I think it at least deserves to be taken seriously. But it's got as we'll see in the politics, it's got a whole bunch of problems because it has some very, very nasty ramifications. But we'll look at that when I turn to the politics. So back to this. Aristotle offers us some further interesting reflections on this. He says, well, look, each species, like human beings and animals and all that, they have a key associated hedone. So what does he mean by that? So there's a key thing that's there, and he says, look, what's important to a donkey? And he gives an example, that chaff, right? So food, right? Food would be much more important to a donkey and give it much more pleasure and all that than gold. So in that sense, what's going to be a highest associated pleasure for a donkey could be different from a dog, even maybe, I don't know if Aristotle really talks about this, but maybe even plants or whatever, they would have different associated pleasures, perfections, or whatnot. Humans, we're more complex. We're not always radically different, but we are definitely more complex. And at the end, we do have a radical difference, and we'll look at that in a later video. But humans certainly have diverse pleasures, right? We have diverse senses, but even when you look at the pleasures of the intellect, there are diverse ones here as well. So Aristotle's like, okay, so we've got these higher kinds of pleasures. Think of them as a set of higher pleasures. A set like playing chess, listening to Beethoven, that kind of material not material, but that kind of sort of non-material enjoyments in the life of the mind, as some people would say. How do we start working in that zone? How do we start ranking within the life of the mind, this very abstract notion of playing chess? You might, because you could play chess in a variety of ways. You don't have to use an actual physical chessboard. You can play chess on a computer. You could play a verbal game of chess. Like some chess masters can play a game totally verbally. Like two chess masters could set the board up and just shout instruction or movements right in the special chess code to each other and play a game totally like that without even having any material objects involved. It could be just simply that way. Like people used to play chess by mail and things like that. So you can have a very abstract, non-corporeal game of chess. Well, what about that versus listening to a symphony by Mozart? Right? So those are two very abstract, but there are certainly examples of hedone. Those are pleasures of the mind. Which one's better? How do you rank that? It seemed to be not so bad when you were ranking senses because you had this notion of matter involved. But what about the person, you know, who's really into geometry and all that? How is that ranked? Well, what's interesting is Aristotle brings it all back down to a very concrete notion. And we need a baseline. We need a baseline. That is, he talks about the good man. The really good man is someone who can help us to see what the good hedone are. Remember, you can have bad hedone because if something is pleasure or hedone associated with a bad activity, it's bad hedone. So the good hedone will be something that appears as good to the good person because they're not going to make mistakes like this. So in other words, Aristotle does have kind of a very good service, sort of like, well, listen to the people that really know this. How do you know that for sure? It doesn't really answer that. But in our sense now, what we've got is that pleasure is a key part of eudaimonia. Pleasures can be ranked. It's not that these are all awful, that Aristotle is saying. By no means is he saying, oh, never have a glass of wine or anything like that. He's not saying that. It's very different. What he's saying is that that's not the highest form of pleasure, right? So there's a whole set of pleasures, the pleasures of the mind, that are more pure than that are higher. And you can also think of pleasures that are associated with sensations, like bodily sensations. We share that with animals. So the donkey likes his chaff. We like our food as well. So we have those pleasures that we share. But those are, again, not truly unique hedone to humans. So what is the unique hedone to humans? Higher, but they're diverse. How are we going to sort of divide all this up? We got to look to the good man. And that leaves us with the final question of chapter 5 in book 10, which is, okay, what's the highest hedone for us, right? There can be a highest hedone for a donkey, but what's the highest, and I should add, human? What's the highest human hedone? What's the thing at the top? What's the most unique hedone for us? What makes us most truly human? The other pleasures are acceptable. They're still good. These things of senses, even up in this high rank of the hedone of the mind, there will be ones that they're good, they're fine, but they're not something that's the most important. Aristotle doesn't really justify that there has to be a highest of the hedone associated with humans and the mind, but he still thinks in the end that there's going to be at least some set or some that give us the highest and make a human life its fullest and give us the fullest sense of the term, what it means to be a human being. So that is going to then lead into the notion of eudaimonia, because after all, eudaimonia was a uniquely human experience of good. So we've got it in terms of a pleasure, but which one, Aristotle says, is going to be the highest of the hedone, such we can say, yeah, that's the good. And then we're on our way to finally doing a wrap-up of what is this thing we started with, namely, what is eudaimonia. See you next video.